Chatto here, and oh shit, this is my third video. I think it's about time for some hot takes, wouldn't you agree? Now, I've been working on this one for quite a while because I really wanted to do the subject justice, and because I think there's a lot to be learned here. Among leftists, the discourse around religion is usually pretty fraught. Takes can range from religion being a uniting force at best, and at worst, religion being antithetical to emancipatory movements, or even just freedom in general. Seeing so many spicy takes about religion was what made me want to make this video in the first place. But to find out if freedom is compatible with religion, we first need to figure out what freedom is. In liberal democracies, which includes most of the modern countries you would probably think of off the top of your head, there's usually a focus on freedom from coercion, also called negative freedom. But less talked about outside academic or leftist circles is freedom of opportunity, also known as positive freedom. Anarchism wants to maximize both of these types of freedom, recognizing that one without the other isn't good enough. So working with both positive and negative freedoms in mind, we can get an idea of what we're looking for. But first, a little disclaimer. I am not a religious person. I think it's safe to say that a lot of anarchists aren't, especially in the global north. But I have a unique perspective when it comes to religion, especially evangelical Christianity. Being American, I'll be talking mostly about Christianity in this video, but I'll try my best to address other religions as well. I was raised in an evangelical household that was usually adjacent to oppressive fundamentalist churches and homeschool organizations. Between all the creationist, dominionist, patriarchal, and capitalist propaganda I heard growing up, I could have easily become embittered toward Christianity as a whole, especially after I stopped believing in it. And while I am opposed to what the fundamentalist Christian right is doing in my country, I realize that their particular flavor of Christianity is a highly cynical one. For most of the Christian right, their religious beliefs are secondary to their political ones, and they use one to justify the other. So, I don't hate Christians or Christianity. There are millions upon millions of Christians in the US and around the world who are able to practice their interpretation of Jesus' teachings without it devolving into bigotry, greed, despotism, and imperialism. In another time or place, another ideology might have filled the role of the official religion of the American right. But what I really want to know is, can someone be an anarchist and also have deep religious beliefs at the same time? Let's start by taking a look at religion from the perspective of some religious anarchists, specifically Christian anarchists. I wasn't all that familiar with Christian anarchism before starting this video, and my research has given me a new appreciation for people living at the intersection of Christianity and anarchism. Far from being an oxymoron, religiously and spiritually motivated radical movements have great potential. As someone who's grown up to see the damage done by the cold-hearted cynicism and greed of the prosperity gospel and the anti-woman, anti-queer Christian American right, it's incredibly refreshing to see people practicing radical Christianity. These folks reject the power-corrupted Hydra arms of the Christian church for decentralized, theologically inspired empathy and community-based mutual aid. And honestly, I'm here for it. Leo Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You is often cited as the foundational text for modern Christian anarchism. Tolstoy argued for the rejection of institutional Christianity, including churches, rituals, hierarchies, and the like, seeing them as antithetical to Jesus' teachings. This overarching theme seems to be the starting point for all Christian anarchist thought. Tolstoy argues that love and kindness for one's neighbors should be the basis for human society. All human beings are equal in God's eyes. By extension, no government or political power is legitimate, and Christians should not support regimes of any kind. I feel like we can get behind a lot of these points, but a potential problem arises when we look at the reasoning undergirding this belief in human equality and solidarity. Instead of believing that we should all help one another because of our inherent value, simply by virtue of being conscious human beings, this command comes from God. It does exactly what Christian doctrine usually does, which is presuppose that God, the higher power, is the origin of all moral and ethical behavior. This can be problematic for anyone considering themselves a Christian anarchist, which we'll get back to later. I'm gonna probably butcher this pronunciation, but sociologist Jacque Ellul, considered one of the foremost Christian anarchists of the 20th century, continued where Tolstoy left off. He didn't just believe that anarchism and Christianity could exist, but that one naturally led to the other. He addresses the criticisms that Marx, Bakunin, and Kropotkin leveled against organized religion and belief in a higher power in general, and admits that they're largely warranted. But Ellul draws a distinction between religion, what he calls the bourgeois metamorphosis of Christianity, meaning the church and its all-powerful God, which would have been known to those early anarchist and communist thinkers, and revelation, or what he considers the liberatory true form of Christianity based on the teachings of Jesus. Ellul uses examples from the Christian Bible to illustrate his point, like how any foreign nations and their leaders mentioned in the Old Testament are depicted as illegitimate, and how God tells his followers to bow to no one but him. Now, if you're familiar with the Christian Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures of the prophets, you'll know that the biblical Israel had kings. That's Israel in the sense of God's chosen people, not the modern state of Israel. David and Solomon are probably the most famous of these biblical kings. Ellul doesn't see this as a contradiction because, according to the Bible, the kings of Israel weren't appointed by God to rule over his people, but by the people themselves, who wanted to be like other nations of the time. That doesn't change the fact that some of Israel's kings were said to have God's favor and were depicted as having a direct line to God himself. So I'm not sure if these examples entirely support Ellul's thesis. Moving on to the Christian New Testament, things are less ambiguous. Jesus is depicted in the Gospels as staunchly anti-Rome and anti-authoritarian in general. A lot of his followers at the time saw him as not just a spiritual leader, but a political one as well. And Jesus' teachings were undoubtedly political, but he seems to have rejected the idea of exercising any kind of political authority, because as he put it, his kingdom was not of this world. Modern Christians often use Jesus' quote, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's," as proof that Christians should submit to an earthly authority, which is not very anarchist. But Ellul argues that what Jesus is actually saying is, and I'm basically paraphrasing here, give Caesar his money because money's not real anyways. If that's true, that's a little more reasonable and definitely compatible with anti-capitalism and anti-statism. Ellul argues that Jesus was in fact rejecting all political authority on earth in favor of the supremacy of God's heavenly authority. The kingdom of God is a concept that shows up a lot in Abrahamic religions. To what degree this kingdom is to be treated as an actual political entity depends on the person or sect. A lot of this is really murky and exists in the territory of theology, which is not very useful for the purposes of anarchists and communists, who tend to be more focused on material reality. And such questions can distract from the fact that if someone follows religious doctrine of theocratic supremacy and actively applies its concepts to politics, it becomes very real. A lot of theologians, Christian or otherwise, will be the first to tell you that the holy texts were often written for a specific audience or to address a specific issue in a specific place or time, and that we should examine the books of the Bible or the surahs of the Quran within the context of the time and place they were written. But hardline fundamentalists would disagree, insisting that the words of the prophets should be treated as literal truths from God, the supreme leader. Is God literally the king of creation? A lot of Christians, Muslims, and Jews think so. Certainly there are theocrats who think that God, and by extension God's laws, in the form of Holy Scripture, should be the basis for civil and criminal law in a modern state. Sharia is one obvious example of this, and maybe a topic for another time. Another example would be the many Jewish communities throughout history who, by way of their insularity, set up dual power structures in their communities, using Jewish law to supplement and often supersede the local laws of the region. In classical Judaism, there's no distinction between civil and religious law. They're one and the same. I could go on to talk about early Christians and the way they built dual power structures under Roman rule, but there's a lot to unpack there, and I think I'll save that for another video. But back to our pal Jacque Ellul. If you wanted to go the debate bro route, you could make the claim that someone like Ellul is using a classic no true Scotsman fallacy, drawing a line in the sand between real Christianity and fake Christianity. The fake kind is a tool of the devil, wielded by the greedy and the power-hungry, and the real kind includes, coincidentally, all the parts of Christian teaching that are theoretically compatible with the core principles of anarchism. But there are always going to be countless interpretations of religious teachings and countless more ways people try to apply them in their lives, and often the lives of others. So this line of thinking is kind of a dead end. No leftist look at religion would be complete without a word from the OG himself. There's a particular Karl Marx quote that often gets trotted out, but let's look at it in its full context here, from his critique of Hegel's philosophy of the right. Marx says, "Religious distress is at the same time the expression of real distress and the protest against real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is required for their real happiness. The demand to give up the illusion about its conditions is the demand to give up a condition which needs illusions." Now there are a few ways to interpret this quote, but to me, it seems like old Karl here thinks that religion is somewhat a necessary evil, but it would be better in the long run if it was done away with completely. The bread Santa himself, Peter Kropotkin, literally wrote the article on anarchism in the 1910 edition of Encyclopedia Britannica. He mentions Tolstoy's influence on anarchism, and didn't seem to see a contradiction in the type of Christian anarchism Tolstoy was proposing, that of nonviolent resistance and the abolition of private property. Or if he did see a contradiction, he doesn't really mention it. One of the works I studied for this video was Mikhail Bakunin's God and the State, regarded as one of the quintessential anarchist texts on religion. Bakunin makes a lot of good points in that essay, but he definitely leans more to the side of criticism of religion. Right out of the gate, he goes absolutely ham on Christian doctrine by being the 19th century equivalent of an edgy fedora tipper. He says, "All religions, with their gods, demigods, prophets, messiahs, and saints, are the product of the fancy and credulity of men who have not yet reached the full development and complete possession of their intellectual powers." Kind of a cringy take, if you ask me. He rightly points out that religion is used as a tool to control the masses and keep people from questioning the status quo. And there's a lot of philosophizing about human nature in there too. But his language is always bogged down in post-Enlightenment ideas of rationalism and Eurocentrism. Not entirely surprising, because as others have pointed out, Bakunin was often closed-minded, as well as being a rabid anti-Semite. Check out Zoe Baker's video for more of that. The internet's former favorite enlightened atheist, Christopher Hitchens, once said, "Religious ideas, supposedly private matters between man and God, are in practice always political ideas." I've seen this sentiment, or something like it, carried over into a lot of leftist discourse. Put plainly, I get what Hitchens was saying, but I still think this take sucks. This attitude seems to be more informed by the Western idea of religion, which is pretty limited. It assumes that religion is a monolith, one which happens to look exactly like religion as it appears in a few modern countries in the global north. Given how many anti-religion types are from that global north, it's no surprise. There's a very common attitude among leftists that religion is inherently authoritarian and counter-revolutionary. I think it's intellectually dishonest and actively harmful to our religious comrades to insist that religion can never be separated from state power or hierarchical oppression. And I think we'll see more than enough evidence for that here. Certainly religion, especially the organized kind, has been used to justify all kinds of oppression and atrocities. And this is where things get tricky. Most ideologies have been co-opted at some point and used as justification for terrible things. But are some ideologies just inherently dangerous? The answer is obviously yes. Fascism, for instance, is inherently dangerous, specifically because it's based on a destructive, dehumanizing premise. But religion isn't an ideology. Rather, it's a type of ideology, one that could be either separate from or intertwined with political ones. And that's an important distinction to make. But then again, we like to say that everything is political. For most people, religion informs their politics. And that's why I can't in good conscience say that religion is 100% off the hook here. As usual, we should take things on a case-by-case basis. Certainly, we should criticize practices and beliefs within religion that are oppressive and destructive. But religion is also something a lot of people find solace and community in. And we can't deny the power of that. And often people do a lot of good in the name of their beliefs. In doing research for this video, one of the more fascinating things I learned about is liberation theology. Liberation theology was a radical Catholic movement starting in Latin America in the 1950s, both within and without the church, but mostly within. And it emphasized religion, specifically Catholicism and the church, as a tool for aid and emancipation of the poor and oppressed. One of the most famous liberation theologians, and the man who invented the term, was an indigenous Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez. Gutierrez was largely responsible for synthesizing Marxist ideas of class struggle with the teachings of the church, and wanted to empower working people to fight the systems of exploitation that kept them impoverished. Now, up until this point, the church had largely represented the interests of the rich elite in Latin America. No surprise there. But as liberation theology spread, local parishes began to facilitate education and community aid programs for the working poor. Ultimately, liberation theology started losing the ideological battle within the Catholic Church during the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s. But as a movement, it brought a lot of poor Latin American Catholics to a point of class unity, and it used the organized religion of the church for some real societal good. So I think there's a lot to be learned from it. But let's look at another example. On the other side of the world from Gutierrez lived a Japanese teacher named Ichikawa Hakugen. Hakugen was a teacher of Zen Buddhism in the 1920s and 30s, and he became increasingly opposed to mainstream Buddhist institutions because of their endorsement of and involvement with Japanese fascism of the time. Hakugen went into hiding during World War II, but after the war, he joined up with the new Japanese Anarchist Federation. He continued teaching and began to write and publish critiques of the new post-war capitalist regime, as well as the old Japanese Zen fascist bargain. He became very involved in anti-Vietnam War protests, and in 1970, he began publishing his own political theories. His most famous work is Buddhist War Responsibility, which further critiqued Zen's war collaboration and continued collaboration with capitalist post-war Japan, and outlined a theory of the fusion of Zen Buddhism and anarcho-communism. I think Hakugen is very pertinent to our topic here because he's a good example of a student and teacher of a religion who saw how his religion was being used to bolster and legitimize totalitarianism and imperialism. And he used his understanding of Buddhism to argue for dismantling the state and capitalist power. I was having trouble finding any of Hakugen's work to read, and I suspect most of them haven't been translated into English yet. But it seems to me that Hakugen was like most religious anarchists, able to see how his faith had been twisted and co-opted by oppressive power structures, and who fought those structures using the dual prongs of religion and anarchism. So learning about these religious movements has been enlightening, but none of it really answers the question: is it a contradiction for someone to be an anarchist and also religious? Well, not all religions involve worshipping a higher power. Many religions are more about ritual and fostering a spiritual connection to the world and the people who live in it. But what about people who worship a god or gods? Anarchy literally means without a ruler, and anarchist movements have always sought to dismantle unjust and unnecessary hierarchies, most notably capitalism and the state. This absence of hierarchy, as we talked about before, is what we would call freedom. But it seems to me that the question really comes down to whether or not you believe that submission to a supernatural being should be considered a hierarchy. And this is where I'm probably going to ruffle some feathers. A quick reminder that I'm an agnostic atheist, so my beliefs are filtered through that ideological lens. So on to the juicy part. Coming at the hierarchy question from an atheist perspective, if a higher supernatural power doesn't exist, then it can't really be a real hierarchy, right? There's no real power being exercised. But belief is a funny thing. If we are to accept that God or gods are social constructs, which I think most atheists would agree with, then we also need to accept that such constructs can have a very real effect on people. Money is also a social construct, but how much pain and suffering has it caused? Are you really going to tell someone who is destitute that money is fake and not worth paying attention to? Doesn't the fact that people organize entire societies around it mean that it's far from meaningless? Likewise, doesn't the fact that people fight wars or pass laws in the name of their favorite social construct, God or Allah or any other, mean that such a higher power is real enough that there are consequences to believing in it? By that logic, submission to a god or gods could be considered an unjust hierarchy in need of dismantling. Such a hierarchy can be both in the mind and exist in reality because humans dreamt it up and behave as if it's real. This certainly seems to be the way that most of the prominent anarchists over the centuries have seen it. Guys like Bakunin and Kropotkin had a low opinion of religion overall. But that doesn't change the fact that there are countless people across the world who truly believe in the principles of anarchism and socialism and want to help make the world better for everyone, while also seeing it as their higher calling from their god or gods to do so. Who are we to tell them that they're wrong and not real anarchists, not real revolutionaries, that they're our ideological enemies? You can make the argument that religion, or at least some religious beliefs, foster an attitude of anti-intellectualism and encourage people to not question authority and the status quo. And this might be true for some sects, but we can't use such broad brushes to paint every single person who practices religion as inherently authoritarian and anti-revolutionary. Certainly, organized religion has been a tool of control from the elite as long as it's existed. We might consider religion to be akin to laws in that respect. But to an anthropologist or sociologist, religion is also a nearly universal element of human culture, like cooking, art, or music. It's often deeply tied with ritual, which is common to every human culture we know of. I think the real danger here is if we try to strictly figure out, or worse yet, decide, if anarchism is compatible with religion. We can get too caught up in gatekeeping and philosophizing. It can easily lead us to embracing the sorts of liberal ideas of purity of virtue and belief that are so antithetical to the practical methodology of anarchist and communist action. At the end of the day, if someone who practices religion believes in self-determination for all people and is dedicated to fighting systems of oppression, I don't see why they're not a real and valuable part of any leftist movement, anarchist, communist, or otherwise. If our motives and methods are aligned, there's no contradiction there. We can fight systems of oppression which use religious doctrine as justification for maintaining themselves, alongside the people who practice religion, and still see those systems for what they are, a tool of the ruling class. This is one of those times where we as anarchists and communists need to not base our beliefs on a dogmatic adherence to the words of long-dead theorists. Both anarchism and Marxism are ideologies deeply rooted in the present and the future. Certainly we can learn from the past, but we can't be so inflexible as to not work with our ideological allies just because they believe and pray to a god or gods. I'm very interested to hear other takes on this from all perspectives. So, if you found this video, please leave a comment with your thoughts on the subject. As always, like, share, and subscribe for more Fully Automated. And find me on Twitter, @CosmonautEcho. Thanks again for watching. This is Echo signing off.